Mr. McIntyre.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The front page of today's Washington Post had a story which said that the government has moved to centralize economic decision-making, it's questioned the need for rigorous free market reform, and it's pledged to aid money-losing industries. If you think the headline of that story was Bush announces economic program, you're wrong, however. It was Poland sours on capitalism. You know, when it comes to the economy, the President really doesn't get it. Rather than proposing this year to do something to help the middle class and boost consumer confidence, as the chairman of this committee proposes, the President wants to undo some of the most important tax reforms of 1986 and reinstate the discredited trickle-down policies that failed in the early 1980s. Rather than rolling back some of the Reagan-era tax cuts that went to the richest people in the country, the President wants to give rich people even larger cuts. And rather than address the growing social and investment deficit in this country, the President wants to reduce domestic spending even further. And finally, rather than living within the constraints of the 1990 budget agreement, the President wants to cover up increased deficit spending with gimmicks and flim-flammery. The President's budget includes proposals to reduce taxes on capital gains, restore real estate tax shelter write-offs for big developers, weaken the alternative minimum tax, enact a supposedly temporary investment tax break, expand eligibility for tax-favored savings accounts to upper-income families, give tax breaks to companies that move plants overseas, and on and on. He apparently fails to understand what most of us ought to know, which is that business and government both have indispensable roles to play in our economy, and neither can succeed without the other. We need business, of course, to produce, to innovate, and to provide jobs. But we equally need the government to educate the workforce, to build and repair the roads, to engage in basic research, to set the rules for commerce, and to offer a safety net for those who don't succeed in the market. Yet the philosophy that the President is pushing would have the government further withdraw from its fundamental economic role and instead, once again, try to usurp the role of business. It's exactly that philosophy that has put us in our current fix. A decade of reckless federal borrowing to pay for a misguided central planning industrial policy which focused on distorting private business and investment decisions through various incentives and upper-income tax breaks, deprived the government of funds, caused major cuts in programs and investments, and made interest in the debt and deposit insurance the only major growth items in the budget. Since 1977, the year before these policies were first put into effect, incomes have fallen for most American families, while they've doubled for the rich. Meanwhile, taxes are up substantially for most families, but are down by 30% for the very rich. And lastly, the typical middle-income family gets about $1,400 a year less in non-Social Security government programs on the domestic side than it did 10 years ago. The middle class has a right to be upset with the government. They're paying more, and they're getting less for it. There's also been major damage in the private sector due to these policies that have been followed in the supply-side era. By artificially stimulating the real estate industry, for example, through tax shelters, we got massive commercial overbuilding at the expense of industrial investment. The inevitable subsequent bust has led to major painful dislocations for both developers and construction workers and helped cause the savings and loan fiasco. Now, in the 1986 Tax Act, Congress and even the Reagan administration made a first attempt to turn away from these failed policies. But as the ranking minority member of this committee has made clear, the purpose of the President's budget on taxes is to undo the 1986 Tax Act, this committee's finest achievement. We urge this committee to reject the President's proposals in their entirety and any ones like them. They are anti-growth, they are unfair, and they are fiscally responsible. We do believe you can do something that will both help the economy and help average families. The Rostenkowski plan is both fiscally responsible and it's fair, and we support it. But we caution you again, do not go back to the failed policies of the past. And I would note, and I'd like to submit for the record, if I might, Mr. Chairman, that every time in the past, certainly within the last 20 years, that capital gains taxes have been cut, the economy has faltered thereafter. And every time that capital gains taxes have been increased, the economy has done better thereafter. So I'm not saying that capital gains changes are the key to the economy, but one thing is very clear. If we're worried about the current recession, cutting the capital gains tax is not the answer. Thank you.
Mr. McIntyre, you've been very patient with our questions, and I know you have probably some different opinions. I'm going to close with you to see if you have any comments, and I'd like to know what your position would be between the two proposals.
Well, we've endorsed the Rostenkowski plan, Mr. Chairman, and we have criticized the Bush one for the reasons you stated, and also because it's targeted towards upper-income families. The higher your tax bracket, the more you'd save from this exemption. So we think it's a very bad idea what the President has proposed, the Rostenkowski one we like. I might point out, by the way, you talked about Japan. They have probably the highest corporate income taxes in the world and the fewest corporate tax incentives in the world, and yet they get lots of investment. They have lots of public investment, too. We have cut our public investment by more than half over the last 20 years, and we've cut domestic spending by 30% almost over the last decade. So to say that we are spending too much on the American people through government, I think is just wrong.